So here's the first point to make, that unipolar depression is the leading cause of disability in Europe. It's the leading cause of disability in all westernized countries at present, and particularly in women, but also almost as much unipolar depression in men as there is alcohol use disorder. So this is an enormous, this is the biggest burden, this is the biggest ill health burden in the Western world. You know, exceeds cancer, exceeds diabetes, exceeds everything. And that's why it's important to think about it and do something about it. Now, when I started in medicine back in the early 1970s, depression was seen as a disorder, a bit like a broken leg. You know, you got depressed, you break your leg. You put your leg in plaster, you put your depression into some kind of drug treatment, and you got better, and it went away. But we now know that was a rather naive and innocent approach, and it's very clear now that in fact depression is a chronic relapsing illness, much more like epilepsy than it is like pneumonia or a broken leg. And evidence for that is shown here in this famous study now by Jean Pei-Kull. He took people who had been depressed, were treated with antidepressants to a point of a degree of recovery. And then he stopped the drugs. And those who fully recovered, didn't have residual symptoms, they did pretty well. You can see over the course of about, this is like 1.5 years, only about 25% relapsed. But those who weren't fully recovered, you can see that half had relapsed, or more than half relapsed within 6 months. And what we now know is that the great effect of antidepressants is to prevent relapse. They're okay at treating the illness, but they're really good at stopping relapse. So where does depression come from? So, one of this set of slides are from a woman called Helen Mayberg, and she has completely reconceptualized the brain mechanisms of depression in the last 20 years using imaging techniques, particularly she uses PET, but you could use MRI to get the same results. And what she did was ask a very simple question. What's going on in the brain in people who are depressed? And she did this by measuring brain activity. In this case, she's using a measure of metabolic activity in radioactive water. And she found, to her surprise, that there were areas of the brain where there was overactivity in depression. And this is a scan from a patients with treatment-resistant depression. And this area of the brain here is an area of the brain called CG25, subgenual singular 25. Now, up to that point, we had all believed that depression was a disorder caused by a loss of emotion. We knew that depression was caused by loss events. If you lost your job, or you lost your partner, or even if you lost a limb, you get depressed. And we all assumed that meant you lost the ability to have a positive mood. But this imaging study suggested that there was an area of the brain where there was overactivity. We'd assumed that the brain in depression would be blue, i.e. less activity. And this discovery of an overactive part of the brain was very surprising. And since you're all psychologists, or most of you psychologists, you've probably heard of this man, William James. And William James is the father, one of the great founding figures of psychology as a discipline. And he wrote a lot about religious experiences, and he took psychedelic drugs to understand consciousness. But he also suffered from depression. And he wrote about his own depression, and this is a quote from him. Depression is a positive and active anguish, a sort of psychical neuralgia, wholly unknown to normal life. And what James was saying was that depression was something that was kind of forced on him. It was something that was driving his brain. And she found this, theoretically, she found this spot that could be driving depression. So how would you prove that that area of the brain caused depression? Because actually, of course, it could just be trying to compensate for depression. It could be an attempt to rectify the depressive deficit. And Mayberg's second great contribution was to say, let's turn it off. How can we turn it off? And she had the great advantage of working at the time in Toronto, where there's a world-famous centre for neurosurgery. And neurosurgeons had developed this technique called deep brain stimulation. And they basically refined it through the treatment of Parkinson's disease. You put electrodes into what's called the subthalamic nucleus in people with Parkinson's disease, and you turn the electrodes on, you switch off the subthalamic nucleus, and people stop trembling. You turn the electrodes off, start trembling. And there are 100,000 people in the world that have that operation. Right? It's a routine operation for middle to end stage Parkinson's disease. So she said to her neurosurgeon, well, do you think you could turn off this region, the subgenual cingulate? And they said, well, we'll give it a go. And they gave it a go. And when the CG25 was turned off, people were no longer depressed. And some of them found that the depression lifted as the electrode was activated, suggesting that the activity of that region was actually driving the depression. That was a truly landmark and remarkable, absolutely remarkable discovery. Yeah? And basically, if you kept it turned off, people stayed well. So that kind of proved that CG25 was driving depression. Right? So it's turned on our head what's going on with depression. Why an area of the brain should make you depressed is a fascinating question, and we may touch on that if you've got questions. I don't think we know the answer, but then we don't know, why many mental disorders occur. But the fact that area of the brain drives depression is an interesting target for interventions. In fact, we now know that many treatments of depression, here you go, so SSRI, CBT, sleep deprivation, ECT, even placebo, if people get better on placebo, activity in CG25 goes down. And then I've shown you the deep brain stimulation also continues. So it seems that this may be the nexus through which drugs and other treatments, psychological treatments for depression, have to work. And more recently, there's been another major insight into the nature of depression, and that's come from neuroimaging studies, which have uncovered this peculiar and interesting network in the brain called the default mode network. Now, the default mode network is, it wasn't considered at all even as a kind of construct, really, until we had imaging. And the way it's been identified and the way it's called the default mode network is those parts of the brain which show increased activity when you're not doing things. And that's why it's called the default mode. So in order to activate your default modes now, I want you all to close your eyes. And by closing your eyes, you've basically taken off the massive stimulation that they've been giving you into your visual cortex. And that dominates so much of conscious life that it's very hard to break away from it. So keep your eyes closed. And now reflect on what you're going to do after this talk. And by that process of dissociating yourself from the external cues and thinking about your future activates the default mode. So here it is, you can open up your eyes again. And you can see the default mode is an anterior-posterior network. It's not actually obviously physically connected, but functionally connected. So these are probability maps. And these show that if this area of the frontal cortex is active, this area is active, and if this is deactive, this is deactive. And the activity of this is completely out of correlation with the sensory motor strip. So if you're doing things, you're not reflecting on yourself. But when you're reflecting on yourself, you're not doing things. And here you can see the anterior, posterior, and the parietal parts of the default mode. And the default mode is your sense of self. It's where you do all your thinking and reflecting about yourself. So what's that got to do with depression? Well, interestingly, it seems to be overactive or over-engaged in depression. So this is a study that looks at the activity in the default mode in normal controls. Here you see the anterior and the posterior correlations, and in patients with major depressive disorder. And you see there's greater connectivity of the default mode in major depression. The reason for that is that CG25, the subgenual cingulate, seems to be orchestrating this increased activity. And what's particularly interesting in terms of symptomatology is the fact that the greater the connectivity here of the default mode, the greater the rumination scores. And that makes perfect sense, because what is depression? Well, depression is par excellence a disorder where people are thinking about themselves. It's what we call an internalizing disorder. It's a disorder of self-reference. People think about themselves and they ruminate. They think about mistakes they've made, they ruminate on errors they've made, they ruminate on guilty thoughts, mistakes they've made, and they have an internal process of excessive concern about themselves. And that makes perfect sense that the default mode network would be over-engaged in depression. So, another major conceptual advance. What drives that? It's still quite challenging, but this is a very recent paper looking at the possibility that the driver for this hyperconnectivity might actually be some other part of the brain. Here's the subgenual cingulate driving it, but also the medial thalamus seems to potentially have a role in orchestrating this overactivity. And that's a very nice imaging paper looking at possible mechanisms of this overactivity. So we've got overactivity, we've got of a circuit, we've got of a self circuit, we've got overactivity of the CG25 driving the self circuit. So what do drugs do? Well, one of the interesting things about working in the field of depression as a psychiatrist is that you've got a lot of choice. Many, many different drugs. Here you can see them all like this through. They work on different targets, they work on enzymes, they work on transporters, they work on receptors. But when you boil it all down, with the exception of these two, they all work on serotonin, whether they block breakdown of serotonin, the uptake of serotonin, they block certain serotonin receptors, or they work on another serotonin receptor. So almost all the antidepressants work through serotonin function. That doesn't mean serotonin is involved in depression, but it certainly means that you can lift depression through changing serotonin. And in recent years, there are two new drugs come along. You probably haven't heard of them. One's called vilazodone, which is an SSRI, a serotonergic uptake blocker, and a 5-HT1A agonist. So it stimulates 5-HT receptors as well as increases serotonin in the synapse. And this one is available in the UK. Vortioxetine Brintellix is an SSRI that has a number of other serotonergic receptor actions built into the molecules. It's the kind of first little designer antidepressant. So these are serotonergic too. So serotonin is certainly the most successful target for interventions with medicines in depression. So how do they work? Well, this is a schematic. Here's a serotonin neuron. There are only 100,000 in your brain, and you've got 200 billion neurons. So the serotonin neuron is actually responsible for quite a lot of activity, given that there's so few of them. Here are the cell bodies down in the raphe. They project up to the forebrain regions. Serotonin is released into the synapse, activates one of, there are probably 14 different serotonin receptors in the brain. But the ones we're going to talk about today, the ones that are really most important for our purposes are the 1A, the 5-HT1A receptor, and the 5-HT2A receptor. But serotonin, like most neurotransmitters, is taken back through uptake sites, transporters, which are blocked by serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And it also acts presynaptically on these autoreceptors, the 5-HT1A or the 5-HT1PD in the terminals. So quite a complicated system. But for the purposes of depression, it's these two receptors which seem most important. So let's look at the 5-HT1A receptor. Well, we are able to image that. One of the reasons I'm working in London now at the Imperial College is because we have the best PET centre certainly in the UK and probably in the world. And we can measure these receptors. We can count the number, the density of these receptors, and we can show that there are fewer of them in people with depression. So look at this receptor distribution. These postsynaptic 5-HT1A receptors all these cortical receptors are postsynaptic, but you see very high density in these prefrontal regions where we've implicated the subgenual abnormalities. Almost none in the visual cortex. Very, very few in the sensory motor cortex. Here are the presynaptic ones. This is the raphe. You can actually see those 100,000 cells you can image because the sensitivity of this tracer is so high. You can actually see the presynaptic receptors and the raphe and all these are postsynaptic receptors. And look, in depressed people, that's a And these are inhibitory receptors. These are the major serotonergic inhibitory receptors. They dampen down cellular activity in the brain. And it kind of makes sense. If you've got less inhibition, then you probably might have more activity of the brain regions that need to be inhibited by the 1A receptors, such as the subunit. The other interesting thing about these receptors is that they don't recover. Depressed people, you've got this reduction in density of these receptors, they stay low. And first degree relatives of them have levels which are somewhat less than normal, so they're in between the depressed people and the controls. So these seem to be a vulnerability marker for depression. They seem to be predisposed to depression. And of course, it would explain why antidepressant drugs which increase serotonin in the synapse need to be taken over the long term, because if you can't normalize these receptors, then what you have to do is replace or increase serotonin in their vicinity so that you can maximize the transmission of serotonergic inhibition through those receptors. And those SSRIs do, as deep brain stimulation does, they reduce the activity of the CG25 region. So this is kind of very consistent. You want to switch that off through a 1A receptor by increasing serotonin, and that reduces depression. There's another theory that's developed about depression, which relates to the fact that in order to maintain optimal functionality of pyramidal cells, and 85% of your brain is basically just a massively sophisticated stacking of pyramidal cells. These pyramidal cells have sort of many branching dendrites, and on the dendrites you have spines onto which come inputs from other pyramidal cells, and that's where the receptors are. Under periods of stress, you get atrophy of those dendritic trees. You get reductions in the number of synaptic spines, and it may be that is why you see the reduced number of 1A receptors in depressed people. And that reason for this shrinkage is because there's a hormone called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is necessary. It's a vital hormone to maintain the integrity of those neurons. And that level of that production of that hormone is reduced if, for instance, you lower levels of serotonin. And it's normalized by restoring levels of serotonin. So that's another explanation as to how antidepressants work. So we've looked at these receptors being a target or maybe a cause of depression. We can restore 5-HT in the synapse and normalize activity there to some extent. But what about these other receptors, these 5-HT2 receptors? But first, before I go on to the 5-HT2 receptor, I just want to make another observation about the role of serotonin in the synapse. So I told you need to take antidepressants for a long time to prevent relapse and depression. That works clinically, but what's the mechanism? Is the mechanism really that you need the serotonin here to keep pumping activity through these receptors? And the answer is yes. And the way we look at that is by using this technique called tryptophan depletion. And tryptophan depletion basically prevents access of L-tryptophan to the brain. And we do that by blocking the uptake. Tryptophan is actively transported in the brain through basically a protein pump. That is also a substrate for other large neutral amino acids. So if you give a lot of these, and you have a low protein, low tryptophan diet, you basically reduce the availability of tryptophan to the brain. And 5-HT is made almost in real time from tryptophan. So if tryptophan levels in the brain fall, 5-HT levels fall about 4 hours later. And that's extremely low tech science. Okay? PET scans cost about £10,000 a scan. This costs about £100 an experiment. But it produces very profound and interesting effects. So this is a measure of mood in people who have been depressed, their mood's been low, they've got better on SSRIs, they're euthymic, which means normal in mood, and then over 4 or 5 hours you deplete serotonin in the brain. And you can see the profound reduction in mood as a result of the serotonin depletion. In fact, some of these patients, before they were treated with the drugs, they had delusional depression. And one of them had a very typical delusion. Depressed people often have the delusion that the devil is on their back, particularly people who are religious. And the devil went after she was treated, but it came back here when serotonin levels fell. And that is a truly important insight, because it tells us that antidepressant drugs don't get rid of depressive thinking. They just stop it accessing consciousness. And that's why you've got people taking it. Because you've got to protect yourself by keeping your serotonin levels up. And interestingly also, another phenomenon in this experiment was as soon as you restore tryptophan availability to the brain by giving someone a cheese and a ham sandwich, within minutes, the mood lifts. So it's very sensitive to changes in serotonin. But this idea that you never get over, you never eliminate the depressive memories, of course makes sense. Why would anyone forget something as powerful to them as the devil being on your back? You know, the same way you don't forget traumatic memories if you've got PTSD. Why would you ever forget depressive memories? You can't. But what you can do is stop them getting into consciousness. You can somehow suppress them. And this is how I conceptualize what's going on with serotonin in depression, and when I talk to my patients about it. I mean, you'll be pleased, no psychologist here, you'll be pleased to know that I rely on a psychological construct, which is one of the most interesting ones in terms of thinking about depression, which is called affective valence. And both depressed and anxious people have what's called negative affective valence. And that's one of the commonest, easiest ways of distinguishing them from normal controls. They have negative affective valence, which means that they see the world as a naturally hostile place. And that may be true, but it doesn't help them, because if you're stuck in it, you'll still suffer even if you do. Most of us see the world as with more positive valence. We see the world as a more positive place, even if it isn't. Now what SSRIs do is they move serotonin levels up, and as you increase serotonin levels, you move affective valence from negative to neutral or positive. And that does two things. That normalizes your mood, but it also provides resilience. And one of the most powerful effects of SSRIs is to provide resilience. And they provide it at the level of cognitions, they provide it at the level of stress hormones like CRF, and they provide it at the level of cardiovascular activity. They have a kind of global resilience-promoting activity through increasing serotonin. But if you deplete serotonin with tryptophan depletion, you just swing them back to where they were before. So that's how we believe SSRIs work. And the mechanism of providing resilience is through the 5-HT1A receptor. Now what about the other receptor, the 5-HT2 receptor? Well, you can see this has actually got a rather different distribution. It's more broadly distributed in the cortex and the 5-HT1A receptor. It's at high-level cortical areas. And interestingly, it's distributed particularly highly expressed on cells in the layer 5 parameter cells here. And these are the cells which do all the cross-cortical communication. So in essence, the brain is a series of 200 billion little computers called pyramidal cells, which do quite a lot of processing in this vertical direction around the cortex or other structures. And the secondary processing, the integration of that processing across the brain, is done through these layer 5 pyramidal cells. So they're the fundamental cells which control high-level brain function. And if you disrupt them, the brain works in a very different way. And they're very, very important cells. They're so important that they have their own inhibitory neurons to make sure they don't get out of control. And both those cells and the inhibitory neurons have the 5-HT2 receptor. And these receptors are altered in depression. Here's one study showing that they're upregulated. Depressed people have more 5-HT2 receptors than non-depressed people. And that could be because they're deficient in serotonin, so the receptor's upregulated. it might be an attempt to compensate. It also raises the question, if you've got more receptors and you give someone a drug to stimulate those receptors, maybe that will stop them being depressed. And maybe it'll downregulate the receptors to make them not depressed. So that was the Oxford study, a study that was done at Imperial in Oxford. This is a study done out of Toronto, looking at the relationship of 5-HT2A receptors in the cortex here and pessimism, dysfunctional attitudes. The more receptors, the greater the pessimism, the greater the dysfunctionality. And again, that raises the question, if you give a 2A agonist to stimulate those receptors, well, could you actually stop people being pessimistic? Could they be more optimistic? And so that's the intellectual basis for thinking about using serotonergic 2A drugs, particularly agonists, to explore the question of the role of these receptors in depression. But we came to it from a slightly different angle. And those are retrospective rationalizations. We came to it from this position, which was asking this very simple question. What do psychedelics do in the brain? How are they psychedelic? Well, we know that all the psychedelic drugs act through agonism at the 5-HT2A receptor, and that the dose you use is determined by their affinity. So here's LSD, very high affinity, here's mescaline, low affinity, and here's psilocybin, which is moderate affinity for the 5-HT2A receptor. Here's some magic mushrooms. And we decided to start working with psilocybin for a number of reasons. The first is it actually gives a relatively short-lived trip of about 13 minutes or so. We give it intravenously, up to a couple of hours if you use it orally. It's very safe. About 1 million people in this country use it every year. Never been any deaths. It doesn't have the hysteria that surrounds LSD. And the other great advantage is that no politician knows how to spell it, so they get quite anxious if they try to criticize it. The psilocybin is just one example of a number of different 5-HT psychedelic substances. Here's the peyote cactus, it makes mescaline, here's the mushrooms. This is ayahuasca being brewed up in the Amazon. Ayahuasca is a combination of two plants. One plant makes DMT, or has DMT in it, and the other plant contains a substance called harmaline, which prevents the breakdown of DMT. So when you drink this mixture, you get DMT into your brain because the liver and the gut enzymes to break it down are blocked by the harmaline. If you just drink DMT by itself, you don't get some effects. Here's Amanita muscaris, the much loved of the Northern Europeans, the Siberians. Morning glory. And here's ergot growing on rye. And here's a picture of a Greek noble person partaking of ergot and wine in part of their ceremonies to have fun and think differently about life. So psychedelic drugs have been around for the whole of humanity. Some people believe that human evolution has been driven by the effects of psychedelic drugs. And it sounds crazy, it's not completely crazy, that concept, as you'll see. In fact, psychedelics only came into medicine about 1952. And that was as a result of the discovery of LSD. So LSD is a synthetic derivative of ergot. Ergot has been around since medieval times as a treatment for postpartum bleeding. It shrinks the uterus after childbirth. It's also been used for centuries to treat migraines. But LSD is a stable analog of ergot and much, much more potent. And it's been used widely. It was used widely from 52 to 67. It was used to model psychosis. It was used to give healthcare professionals experiences of what it was like to have a psychotic-like experience. It was used in psychotherapy to facilitate psychotherapy or to produce a profound disruption of people's mental state so that they would emerge out of their illness in some kind of what we used to call psychedelic psychotherapy. So it was widely used. And from the 50s and 60s, the US government funded 140 separate studies of LSD. There were 1,000 papers published, 40,000 patients. But people started to get interested in the effects of psychedelics on themselves rather than on their patients. And of course, one of the great pioneers of this was this man, Aldous Huxley. And he's an interesting man. His brother was a professor here. His brother was the recently deceased professor of physiology at this university, Andrew Huxley. He got the Nobel Prize in 1960 for uncoupling, decoding the action potential. Aldous was the elder stepbrother. And he couldn't be a doctor because he had problems with his sight, so he became a literary figure. And his eyes were literally opened when he took mescaline. And he tried to explain the impact of mescaline, not by writing about it, he did write about it rather beautifully, but in order to make sense of it, he went back to the writings of William Blake. William Blake is the man that wrote Jerusalem, the English national anthem, you know him. And Blake was a visionary and a remarkable man who saw things that other people couldn't see, and understood why people couldn't see what he saw, because he said this: if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through the narrow chinks of his cavern. And Blake was saying, basically, most humans don't really see what's out there, they have a very limited view. And poets and artists can actually see things rather differently. And Huxley said, based on his experience with mescaline, that Blake was right, and that there is a constraint on what we see. And Huxley then said the brain is an instrument for controlling the mind. And that's a wonderful insight from a single experience, a couple of experiences of mescaline. Because he was not only right, in terms of, but we now know that modern neuroscience is really right. But more than that, we now know that drugs like mescaline break the ability of the brain to control the mind. And that's why they're so powerful. Let me explain it to you. So, we now know that when you see something, you don't see what's out there. When you're looking at me, you're not actually seeing me. Your brain isn't taking photographs of me. What your brain is doing, as it's doing to this image here, of a sky, what your brain is doing is decoding the different elements of the visual image. It's decoding the colors and shapes and place and the movement through different cells in your retina. And those electrical impulses are going into the brain, into different parts of the brain. And those different images, the different signals are being reconstructed to your brain's best guess as to what's going on. And generally, you're looking at me now, you're expecting me to be the same here as here. You see the same me. Okay, generally. So what you see is constrained by what your brain expects to see and what your brain will allow you to see. And most of us, when we're looking through the chinks of our cavern, we see nice things. We see, hopefully, sunlight and clouds and flowers and things. But some people don't. Depressed people don't see nice things. When depressed people look through the chinks of their cavern, they see souls burning in the fires of hell. And we know that because they dream that, even if they don't see it. And when alcoholics or addicts look through the chinks of their cavern, their brain makes them see their objects of desire, their bottles or their syringes. So the brain constrains very much how we perceive the world. The brain determines how we perceive it. And that is why some people get locked into depressive thinking, because their brain somehow, for some reason, begins to make them think those negative, ruminative, self-critical thoughts. Well, what's that got to do with psychedelics? Well, the most remarkable thing that we found by doing our experiments with psilocybin was that the hippies were wrong. Psychedelics do not turn on the brain, they turn off the brain. Here you are, and you see brain activity following psilocybin is decreased in the posterior cingulate cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the thalamus. And we're pretty sure that switching off is related to the experiences because there's a strong correlation. The greater the reduction in activity in those brain regions, the greater the symptoms, or the experiences, the subjective experiences. So it looks like those regions actually are the regions which are mediating the effects of psychedelic, but they've been switched off. And that was a complete revolution. In fact, it was such a bizarre finding, we didn't believe it ourselves. We actually repeated the experiment another time just to make sure we got it right. But we had, and it's true. That's what these drugs do. So how does that fit in with the experience, the psychedelic experience? Well, one way of looking at it is this, is that those regions of the brain are the default mode network. They're the areas, the regions of the brain which regulate normal brain function. They regulate your sense of feeling of yourself. And so they used to be called the connector hubs. So those regions we switched off. The top region, the anterior cingulate, this is the area that coordinates your emotions, with your memories, with your plans and your anticipation. And the posterior cingulate is the connector hub that basically connects all your sensations. It connects your vision, your hearing, your proprioception, your sense of taste and touch, with your motive desires, but also with your plans. So these two work together to orchestrate the brain, they drive the function. They're a bit like the orchestra, the conductor of an orchestra. And when the conductor's there, the orchestra does exactly what it's told. And it does the same thing as it's done forever. If you're playing a Mozart symphony, you will play it the same way forever. But if the conductor goes away and the instruments are allowed to do their own thing, then you might stop playing Mozart. You might start playing jazz. You might start syncopating. You might start doing things differently. And what psychedelics do is they break down the process which has been laid into the brain all of your life. The whole process of learning and education is to make sure that your brain does the same as everyone else's brain. Your parents largely want your brain to do the same as them. They want you to be kind of replicas, and society wants you to be replicas. And generally you are. But under psychedelics, you can actually, for a short period, see things differently. And here's an example. Here's the fragmentation of the default mode under psilocybin. It completely destroyed it. There is no default mode. And that's why people feel that they're floating out of the scanner. They're floating off to space. They're seeing God because the normal sense of self is completely disrupted. Well, is that why they get better? Because if you haven't got a default mode, and the default mode is driving repetitive rumination, depression, then how can you be depressed? You just don't have the capacity to be depressed because you haven't got the brain. And that may be one reason why this treatment is not useful for depression. They actually allow people to escape from it even for a short while. One of the interesting things that surprised us when we did this work was that many of our people, when they came out of the scanner, they said they often felt quite good. I mean, it's a weird environment in which to have a psychedelic scanner and the horrible things at the best of times. But people will often come out and say, "Oh, it was interesting. I feel good." And they will often say, "I felt well for a few weeks." And that correlated with this work from Roland Griffiths and John Hopkins, who've been using a single dose of psilocybin, the same dose as us, in psychotherapy. He was giving people who wanted to experience something more in life, a psychedelic trip, and then monitoring them for months. He's monitored them now for 5 years, and most of them are still very well, and a lot of them say it was one of the most powerful experiences of their life. They felt better, and they illuminated. And so we wondered, well, could this be an antidepressant effect? And then we looked again at our data, and we looked in a slightly different way, and we looked at activity here in CG25, and it was down, it was reduced by psilocybin, just like other effective antidepressant treatments. And that was why we thought, well, maybe this could be an antidepressant treatment. So we ran a grant, and to my amazement, we got it. The only money we've ever got from the government to do this research because it's seen as politically too sensitive. But because depression is such an enormous problem, we got this grant, experimental medicine grant from LSE. And to get the grant was easy, compared with what else it took. It took 3 iterations in a year to get ethical permission to use this drug. And the ethics committee in the end said, you cannot do a controlled trial because it's too dangerous. And I said, well, 1 million people a year for the last 20, 30 years in Britain, no deaths. It can't be that dangerous. He said, you've got to do a safety study. You've got to give it to your 12 patients, and you've got to follow each of them up for 6 months. And when the last one has survived the 6 months, you can then do it. Which was absurd. No drug, not even cytotoxics have ever been asked to have that kind of safety. But in the end, there's nothing you can do. The ethics committee can control this. So we said, okay, we'll do that, but please allow us to measure mood as well, in case they got more depressed. And he said, oh yeah, we must measure mood, yes. But mostly you want to measure whether they're alive. Okay. The drug supply took 30 months to get. Only one place in the world could make it. And the regulatory hurdles of getting it from that country to this country took 30 months. And then it took 2 more months for the government's MHRA to approve it. So it took 32 of the 36 months to get the drug. You know, that's extraordinarily wasteful of research money. And in the end, it cost £1,500 a dose. And that's because people like me are treated as drug dealers. You work with illegal drugs, you're treated as drug dealers. You have to have a special police check to be able to hold and work with psilocybin. And I say, I'm a doctor, I can write a prescription for heroin. If I want to make money selling drugs, I'm not going to get out of the street selling psilocybin at £1,500 a dose. There are no takers. I'll take heroin out of. No, it doesn't matter. It's an illegal drug, and therefore we've got to make sure that you're treated different. I mean, it's absurd, and it's all a historical artifact of the war on drugs. But anyway, we got through it, we did the study. We started off giving it to 12 people, single dose, built it up to 20 afterwards. And the effects were remarkable. So here you see, this is the self-rating scale of mood, 1 week after the trip. Very, very great reduction, and then effect peaked between about 2 and 3 weeks, and then began to wear off after 3 months. But you've still got an effect size here of 2, which is twice that of any other antidepressant. And here are all the subjects going out to 6 months, and you can see that everyone got a bit better. Some people got extraordinarily well and stayed well for months and months and months, and others did a bit better and then relapsed. And there are probably several different groups in there. We don't understand why they're different. That's something we're very interested in exploring. But overall, this was a really powerful effect, still highly significant at 6 months in the whole group. And we were also interested in the mechanism, what's going on. We were able to image people using this amygdala activation paradigm before and after treatment. Now, this is a widely used paradigm. You show someone a fearful face in a scanner, and their amygdala lights up. And depressed people get more activation in amygdala than non-depressed people because they're more reactive to negative impulse. And antidepressants, SSRIs, blunt that. That's actually how they work. In fact, here's a meta-analysis of antidepressant effects in the amygdala. But yeah, I mean, it's just an established fact. Antidepressants blunt amygdala reactivity to faces. So we did the same before and after our psychotherapy. We did fearful faces, we did happy faces, we did neutral faces. And what we found, interestingly, was that activation to fearful faces and happy faces, and neutral faces, were greater after psilocybin the day after than before. And in fact, this is the fearful face being greater in activation than the neutral face. So this is exactly the opposite of what we predicted. And that's always a good sign. In science, if you get exactly the wrong answer, there's no bias. You're not manipulating the data to get P point at 5. You discover something interesting, something this is completely unexpected. And we also discovered that the more activity in the amygdala the day after, the better the clinical outcome. Wow, that was really interesting. So we started to think, what's this mean? Well, compare psilocybin here, psychedelics here, with antidepressants. Antidepressants decrease activity in the amygdala, whereas psychedelics increase it. With happy faces, antidepressants have a mixed effect, psychedelics increase it. And we started to think maybe they work in different ways. We know that SSRIs protect and relieve negative emotions. They give you resilience, whereas maybe psychedelics work differently. Maybe they actually allow you to overcome the depression by working out what made you depressed in the first place, and then resolving that. And we showed this psilocybin does change attitude. Here we're seeing that negative valence again. Here we're seeing the pessimism bias in depressed people before treatment, and we're seeing its normalized attitude. And here's a patient, quote, "My outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now it's pointless to get wrapped up in endless negativity. I feel as if I've seen a much clearer picture." So this is like someone, often a lot of the patients describe that being rebooted. They were locked in a mindset of negative thinking, psilocybin, afterwards, they could think normally again, for the first time in years. And so this is the theory we're currently developing. This has just been published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. It's a free download, please go and look at it. But we're arguing now that there are two ways to live depression. The traditional way is to focus on the 5-HT1A receptors in the limbic system, to increase signaling at that receptor using an uptake blocker. This reduces stress and emotional responsibility, dampens the amygdala, can reduce anxiety as well. It promotes patient making, increased resilience, but it can cause emotional blunting. SSRIs kind of protect you. They put a kind of like a force screen around you, an emotional force screen, so you're not so damaged or stressed by life. Whereas the 5-HT2 receptor, they work much more in the cortex. When you take these drugs, you get a fragmentation of brain function. We call it increased entropy. The brain is more flexible. You can change the way you think about things. You can start viewing the cause of your depression in a different way. Breaks down to separation. And it gives you more cognitive flexibility. And you can overcome your depression potentially. So these, for the 2A receptor, we think you increase well-being. And for the 1A receptor, you decrease depression by blunting stress. So that's our current theory. That's really the core of where we are at present. And I hope you find it interesting, because it's definitely a conceptualization of the role of the cortex in depression. And I'm going to just finish with this statement from George Bernard Shaw, a great philosopher and playwright. He said, "Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything." And that is absolutely true, and it's very true of politicians. And I hope that our research can make people change their minds about psychedelics. Because it seems bizarre to deny drugs which are as safe as they are to a population which is suffering as much as depressed people. So I want to acknowledge loads of people that help with this research, particularly Robin Carhart-Harris, who leads the psychedelic team in my group, and Amanda Fielding, who's one of the who runs the Beckley Foundation, who's pumped prime and helped us with some of this research. And I'll finish with that model again, and then I'll take questions. Thank you very much.